So screen here. Screen one. All right, everybody can see the stream.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. Okay. So I'm Stephen Cheney, and we're going to be today. Please mute if you're not me. Okay, I'm Stephen Cheney, and today we're going to talk about attacking with a passing step. So, if you've been a regular in the longsword channel here, or if you've been lurking there or whatever, none of this material will be entirely new to you, and in fact, nothing here is really super new material in general. A lot of good passing step, I guess, research and practice has been going on for a long time in HEMA, but we kind of find ourselves in the situation right now where if you look at high-level tournament footage or even low-level tournament footage, any kind of tournament footage, it's very rare to see people actually attacking with a passing step, besides like your normal flesh from a dominant foot forward. So most fencing tends to be done with the dominant foot forward and without the normal passing step attack that we kind of expect to see based on the sources. So I'm going to be approaching this from a KDF perspective. So let's start with the actual KDF or a KDF gloss. So this is from Yud Lev here, and it's the first lesson in the entire gloss. So I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but essentially I have it color coded here. So the top bolded part is kind of the goals, I guess, that they're trying to set out. So learning to hue the hues correctly, and then I have it color coded based on what I see as the constraints being laid out here. So next slide. So the red text tells us to, or at least the way I interpret it, tells us that we should be hewing with a passing step. Orange, hue long and correct. Blue, make sure the sword has its correct path. Some sources say in front of the opposite foot, so it's kind of what I assume it means by the correct path. And purple, body and balance. So going back to the text, so you can kind of read that on your own time, and if you disagree with my interpretation, then maybe we can talk about that later. But those are the assumptions that I'm going to go forward with when we talk about attacking with a passing step. So one thing we have to note here is that we're talking about a hue or a cut. So I'm going to use the word cut throughout this presentation, not hue. So what are we trying to accomplish with a cut? That's where we really need to start. We can't start with the passing step because the passing step is not a goal, it's a constraint. So we have to start with our goals. And the question becomes, what is the goal of a cut? So there are two goals that we can consider to a cut, and both of them are a little bit at odds with each other. So one is maximizing for cutting ability, and one is maximizing for the ability to land a hit on a resisting opponent. So we can see examples of each. So first, we have an example of a cut that's maximized for cutting ability. Can everybody, first of all, can everybody see the video? Just making sure I'm doing this right.
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good.
Right. So we're maximizing for cutting ability. So here we have Watakiri Batosai cutting through 5 mats, and then we'll see him cut through 7 mats. Which anybody who has done cutting on tatami before understands how difficult of a task this is. It's very it's very hard to cut through that many mats. So we can assume that his mechanics are highly specialized, and probably his sword also, for cutting through a target. So you can kind of look at his movement here. So we can see his starting position. He doesn't do any, you know, kind of preparatory like feint motions or anything, or any weird footwork stuff walking up. He doesn't have to, because his target's not moving, it's standing still. He starts from a very retracted position, you know, to get the best cutting arc he can, so he can accelerate his sword, you know, as fast as possible. He so if we look at the cut again, so he's leaving his feet on the ground the whole time. His feet are firmly planted, and he's got a very solid base. He might do a slight hop, I guess, before he cuts. See, his heels are up, so he can put his weight into the cut. The sword's kind of blurry, but you can see he's not cutting with the tip. So here's the tip of the sword here, and he's cutting closer to what we can refer to as the sweet spot of the sword, which isn't necessarily the tip. It might even be closer to the middle, or in some cases even the strong. And you know, obviously he cuts all the way through. So those are some kind of attributes of a cut maximized for cutting a target. So for a cut maximized for landing a hit on the opponent, I use saber as an example, because in saber, so modern saber fencing, you have the entire blade is electrified. So when any part of the blade touches the target area on your opponent, it counts as a point, or you know, it counts as a valid hit. So you know, obviously edge alignment doesn't matter. What part of the blade you hit with doesn't matter. So you can hit with like the very tip of it, and it'll still be fine. So let's just see what a couple of these look like, if YouTube works. So this is a compilation of flunges, which is kind of a fake move in saber, an artifact of the rule against passing your back foot in front of your front foot. So you can see the fencers are using very explosive movement, you know, launching themselves at their opponent. And like I mentioned before, they don't care about edge alignment. They don't care about what part of the blade they touch with. They're just trying to touch with any part of it. And they're using a lot of preparatory actions to set up the actual touch, because they need to do something to, you know, trick their opponent or create an opening to get to their opponent. So back to PowerPoint. Right. So a couple things real quick that both of them have in common are extension. So in both cases, you want to, you know, obviously if you're trying to land a hit, you want to be extended out so you can have your maximum reach. And when you're cutting, maximum extension means maximum tip velocity. So you generally want to be extended. That's not to say it's impossible to cut or land a hit without extension, but it's generally a good thing. And the same with posture. So, you know, obviously for cutting you want good posture, but even for fencing, so this guy doing a flunge here, even though he's leaned over very far, but his back is still straight. So um, posture is always important to for various reasons. Okay, so a little bit more about cutting. So, oh well, first of all, okay. So the point of that being, when we're trying to figure out what kind of cut we want to do in in HEMA and longsword specifically, we kind of are looking to find a balance between these two, because we do want to, retain some sort of, idea of cutting, because, my reasoning for that is because that's what I think the expected attack in the sources are, because they talk about, using the power of your body and like doing a big long hew. So I want to, retain things like edge alignment and probably some kind of arc, like some kind of cutting arc. But at the same time, you want to be able to reach your opponent. You're not going to be able to just walk up to your opponent and do like a cut that's maximized for cutting, because they're not going to allow you to do it. All right, so a little bit more about cutting. So why is it important to learn cutting, even if we have this, this sport that we have, this artificial game that's not necessarily simulating sword fight? Well, there's a lot of good reasons to learn cutting. Body awareness. So you want to know how to use your body in a way that will, create a good cut. It's also going to make your cuts more efficient and give you good structure. And so safety, the point with safety is, so you think, so when you're hitting a target, when you're hitting your opponent, in order to hit them safely, you are not going to be cutting all the way through. You kind of want to aim for the surface of their target so it doesn't like brain them, I guess. However, the same movements that you use for good cutting, so you want to use like a squeezing of the fingers to accelerate the sword to cut. You also want to use the same idea to decelerate the sword as quickly as possible when you're hitting your opponent. So theoretically, if you're good at cutting, then you also will be good at keeping your opponent safe and not giving them concussions. So about landing a hit. So I want to talk a little bit about the simple attack, the direct attack. I learned recently that my idea of what I thought was the definition of a direct attack is wrong, so I kind of hesitate to say direct attack now. But what I mean is an attack that is intended to hit the target. So you go and throw an attack, and that attack you expect to hit. Maybe it'll get parried, maybe not, but you're intending to hit it. So this is important, obviously, to hit your opponent, because that's the point of fencing. If you're not trying to hit your opponent, then why are you even fencing? And also to set up compound attacks. So a compound attack you often set up using a feint or a fake attack, and if your opponent is not convinced that the fake attack is real, then it's not going to work, basically. So you need to have a good direct attack in order to set up fake, like convincing fake attacks. So if we're we can look to the sources to kind of guide us about this. And in RDL, or specifically Lev, you have the Hugh Nearing What You Want verse in the Common Lessons, which tells us to aim at the target and not at the opponent's openings and not their sword. And also later in the Zornhau section, we have advice to, aim at an opening and attack it without regard to what our opponent fences against us. So clearly they want us to do attacks intending to hit, sometimes. If you're into 3227A, that gives probably the clearest analogy of, acting like there's a string attached to the tip of your sword and your opponent, and, the string is pulling their sword directly to the opening. So to me, it's difficult to argue that that's not talking about a direct attack. So the other thing about attacking intending to hit is that speed matters. So we've kind of come up with this semi-arbitrary limit of 350 milliseconds as kind of a cutoff between an attack that's likely to land, or an attack that has a chance of landing, and an attack that's more than likely going to get parried. And that's based off of, some analysis of certain attacks and, attacks that are getting ready. But ultimately, it's pretty arbitrary. You can have attacks that are greater than 350 milliseconds that land, or you can have, being under 350 milliseconds doesn't guarantee that you're going to hit. It just reduces the chance that they'll be able to parry because of the time of a human reaction cycle. Okay. So let's move on to a passing step. So what is going on in or let's define passing step first. So I define it here as a step. Let me look at what I specifically wrote. So it's a step. It's a footwork movement in which the action is ended with the opposite foot forward from the starting position. So you start with 1 foot forward, and by the end of the action, the opposite foot is forward. So we can separate. So if we're talking about a step that is meant to cover distance, and in which one foot is planted, because not all steps are like that. But if we're talking about that type of step, which is the one that I'm really interested in for this presentation, we can separate it into 2 phases. So when you're walking, your steps are basically a series of falling forward and catching yourself. So you can separate it into the phases of the weight shift, where you're shifting from your back foot to your front foot, and then the recovery, in which you're moving your formerly back foot in front in order to catch yourself before you fall forward. So we have the 2 phases: weight shift and recovery. Positions, obviously starting and ending position. And then this transitory position, it's not anything specific, it's just a general term for any position between the start and the end. Next. So other types of passing step. So like I mentioned, the ones that I'm mostly interested in for the purposes of this presentation is the basic step. So that's where we have a foot planted and we're trying to, cover distance, explosively sometimes if we need to. And we have 1 foot planted as we do that. So you can power it either by the back leg or the front leg, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit. So other types of passing steps, you can do a foot switch. So if you kind of do a little hop and switch your feet, so your back foot comes forward and your front foot comes backwards. And maybe you cover distance, maybe you don't, but you don't cover like as much distance as a basic step. Regular walking, you know, sometimes you'll just walk at your opponent for whatever reason. And those are technically passing steps, but we're not interested in them for the purposes of this. Crossover step, the way that I, you know, what I'm thinking about here is a step where you don't rotate your hips or your body. Your feet kind of stay as they were, and you know, cross over in order to close distance. So you're, you know, imagine if you have like a single-handed sword and you have your sword hand forward, you leave your body profiled as you do like crossover steps. And a non-committal step, what I mean by that is a step where you leave the weight on your plant foot. So you leave your weight on your plant foot throughout the step, and you don't commit to the movement until you put your foot down. So you're not really recovering. You're kind of you know, balancing on the one leg, and you can bring your other foot forward and then kind of shift when you need to. So it's, you know, it's a non-committal step. And for an example of that, the only person I've seen do this is Moreno di Ricci. Sorry for the pronunciation. And he uses it in his sparring sometimes. It makes his fencing look very unique. And also, Eddie Lewis tried to show me this type of step a couple years ago, and yeah, so he uses it as well. But like I mentioned, the basic step is what we're going to be focusing on here. So step, you know, plant foot, weight shift phase, recovery phase. All right, so starting positions of the step. So there's a couple different starting positions. In general, we're going to start with our non-dominant foot forward. And that's because we want to, well, first of all, looking at the text, they tell us to start with our, you know, our opposite foot forward from the side that we're leading from. And, you know, and generally we want to end with our dominant foot forward to, you know, be prepared to do whatever we have to do next. So posture, you can start more upright. You can start more with a lean of the upper body. And the leaning version I've been referring to as the sprinter's posture. So here you can see a sprinter's three-point starting stance. And what that allows is more explosiveness off of both feet as soon as you want to start the attack. But the drawback is you're already committed forward. So your weight is already kind of on your front foot. So it makes it difficult to, you know, if you want to do something other than a forward direct attack, it makes it more difficult to do that. So in general for fencing, we'll start in a more upright posture. And then, you know, it takes a little bit longer to do the actual attack, but you know, you can still do it within that that 350 millisecond barrier. So pre-step we can also do. So what I mean by that is, I have a video. So there's two types of pre-step that I'm going to talk about, I guess. So this is where you kind of move the front foot forward or backwards before you go. So the first one is the half step, and that's taking a step in, and off of that step launching your attack. So the benefit of this is there's a few benefits to this. First, you close the distance a little bit more, you get a little bit closer to your opponent. Second, you build a little bit of momentum going forward for your attack, so you shave a little bit of time off of the time it takes to build momentum from nothing. And third, you enter without a huge commitment. The video is not being great right now. Okay, well, so the second the second one that I have in mind is the false step, and that is where you bring the front foot backwards a little bit while leaving your body weight up above, which which loads your weight onto that front foot, so you can drive off of both legs as soon as you want to go. And the reason that these pre-steps are important. Okay, so there's an example of the false step, and there's a couple more here. So this kind of puts you in more of a sprinter's posture before you go. So the reason it's important to use these pre-steps is because when we're actually fencing, it's going to be a dynamic situation. You're going to be moving in and out, and all that stuff is going on. So preparatory motion is important. So some examples that are a little bit more alive. All right. All right, so posture, half step, and false step. Okay, the performing of the step. So when we do the step, it's okay to have a forward lean a little bit, and depending on what you're trying to accomplish, it might even be optimal to have a forward lean. So we haven't gone into the putting the cut to the step yet. So depending on how you're attaching the cut to the step, you may want to maintain an upright posture throughout the step, or you may want to have a forward lean, but not too much of a forward lean. So if you lean forward too much, then you'll be off balance when you land, and you may be forced to take more steps forward that you don't want to, and in general, you just want to be in balance when you land, so you can continue to be in control of what your body is doing. The straight line idea is it's not, take it with a grain of salt. It's not like a scientific thing. It's just kind of an observation of what happens when people take successful passing or lunging steps, and that is a straight line is formed, but when at the moment that the foot is about to leave the ground, the leg and torso form a straight line from the foot to the shoulder. So you can see it in HEMA examples and longsword examples, and also in other modern sword sport examples. So kendo and fencing as well. Even though in kendo we're taught to always keep the torso upright. When you look at tournament footage, people still lean forward. So what does that tell you about how steps should be done? And these pictures, so these modern Olympic fencing pictures, they're both épée, and these are both right at the start of a flèche. So it's the moment before their rear foot leaves the ground in a flèche attack. Okay. So, ending position. So there's two ways that you can end a passing step. And one is firm-footed, and one is continuing your momentum. So running it through. Firm-footed seems to be closer to what Lev is describing. Landing well in balance and being ready for your next attack. If you're learning how to do a firm-footed attack, start small. So the bigger your step is, the more lunge-like your ending is going to be, and that can put some stress on your front knee. So if you're just starting this, make sure you know how to have a correct knee and foot position on your landing before you start really landing hard with these lunge-like landings. So continued momentum. Obviously, the flèche, as we mentioned before, is an example of this. So instead of landing firm-footed and being ready for your next attack, you kind of continue your momentum forward and run through with it. So it's okay to do this sometimes if you're trying to do it, but you have less choice of what to do next, which could be like an advantage to you because it also gives your opponent less choices. You're usually going to end up in grappling, or if you run to the side, then breaking distance so you can start again. Just make sure you do the Qui-Gon Jinn block so they don't hit you on the back of the head. And also don't do it by accident. So if you want to run through, then run through, but don't run through when you mean to land firm-footed, because if that happens, then it means you're too off balance in a forward direction. So your lean is probably a little bit too much. And you have to take those extra steps for recovery. Okay. So a couple other notes on steps. Comparison with the lunge or advanced type step. So when you're taking a passing step, from the start of the attack, or from the start of the step to the landing, your foot is in the air for longer. And as long as your foot is in the air, you don't have as much freedom to change directions or move in a different way. You're kind of committed to your forward motion. You have a little bit of freedom. You can spring a little further or change your direction a little bit, but for the most part, you're committed to your forward motion, unless you do the non-committal step. But we're not talking about that. Ask Marino Diorici about that. And you also end closer to your target, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. Why you end up closer, but essentially, if you're doing an attack, if you're doing a direct attack, we'll talk about it later. Passing steps in other modern sword sports. Again, we've discussed the flèche in foil and épée. It's not used in saber anymore because you're not allowed to cross your back foot in front of your front foot during an attack. In kendo, it's uncommon to do a passing step, but there's a couple different scenarios where you might. One of them, or both of them, are from Jodan, which is kind of, high fumtag, holding the sword over your head. If you're going for the forearm hit, you might do a little foot switch before you hit. And when you do a right side do, you slide your foot forward and then hit. I have a video of that just to help visualize. So go in slow motion. So the foot comes forward, lands, and then the attack is made. So this, notice it's with a feint to the upper targets. So it's accompanied by a feint to the upper target, and then the attack is made after the foot has already landed. Let's just watch it. Foot lands, hit made. And then the direction is changed to continue the momentum. So, timing the cut with the step. There's a couple different ways that you can time the cut with the step. You can do it, relative to the weight shift and recovery phases that we talked about earlier. You can cut before the weight shift phase, during the weight shift phase, or during or after the recovery phase. I used to have 4. I used to have a separate one for during and after the recovery phase, but the use cases kind of meld together, so I combined them both into one. So the uses of each one before the weight shift phase. So if you do this, you're not really going to have to take a step at all, except maybe if you want to. And so let me be clear first that when we talk about cutting here, I mean actually aiming to strike the opponent with a cut. So I'm not talking about lining up a thrust and then coming in. So if you're lining up a thrust, then sure, you can do the cut before you step and then step in. But if you're just cutting to cut, then by the time you do the swing, you already have to be in range to cut the person. So you can use that when the other person is closing the distance for you, so as a counterattack, or when sniping a shallow target. So the opponent has come closer, has come a little bit too close, and they think they're safe, but you can snipe their target without taking a step, or maybe with a little bit of lean and then take a step afterwards to recover. So during the weight shift phase is what we're mostly interested in here, and that's your direct attack timing. So doing an attack, especially to a deep target that is intended to hit the opponent. And then during or after the recovery phase. So the kendo one that we just watched is an example of this. So compound attacks and distance traps. So that would have been an example of a compound attack, because you're threatening high, and then as they raise their arms, you go low, and you do that after your foot has already landed. So after the recovery phase. Right, and also distance traps is another thing. So you can score by, you can time the cut like this if your opponent has gotten used to a certain distance that you're attacking, and then you come in and they step back a little bit to where they think they're safe, but instead of doing the during weight shift phase, you do it after, which gains you a little bit more distance, and you can still hit them on the hand or whatever. So during the weight shift phase is what we have been calling the ballistic passing step, because at the time that you make the hit, your body is still in the ballistic process of the step. So you need to come forward and recover after that happens. Okay, so distance and its relation to cut timing. So we have a little bit of this. This chart may seem intimidating at first, but we'll go through it. So at different distances, so you can kind of separate the use cases of each timing into different distances. So when you're close, you can cut without any step at all. You can cut or just with the lean, and that's going to be your okay. Well, let's start with critical shoulder distance. So when you hit somebody with your sword, the limiting factor on how far away you have to be when you hit them is the position of your shoulders. So no matter where my lower body is or my feet, if my shoulders are at the distance, you know, from my opponent of my full extension, then I'll be able to hit them. So you can kind of think of the goal of any attacking motion to get your to get your shoulders into that critical shoulder distance. So every other action is kind of in service of that goal to get your shoulders into the critical shoulder distance. So if you step back a bit from critical shoulder distance, you can probably still hit without taking a step. Well, you definitely can still hit without taking a step. And you'll have to lean the body forward a little bit in order to accomplish that. Once you get to the point where your leaning will make you too forward balanced and you must recover with a step, that's called critical step distance. So anytime past that, you'll be forced to take a step. And then we have maximum distance, which is the distance where you will land in critical shoulder distance after taking a full passing step. And beyond max distance, you can't reach your target. So when you take your step, if it's right, so when you take your step, which will be between critical step distance and max distance, your foot will land. Well, your body will end up closer than critical shoulder distance. So you will be closer. You know, you'll be within you know, a closer distance to your target, and that's kind of determined by your step size. So let's go to the progression video. Oh, this is about timing the cut, and I should have played this before. So here, Dustin Reagan demonstrates different timings of your cut with respect to your step. So once again, right. So each have their uses. All right. So here we can see the progression that I was kind of getting at with the chart. So you can start. So here I start at a position where I don't have to move my body forward at all. I'm just standing still, and just my cutting action hits. So that would be my critical shoulder distance. So you can line up where my shoulders are here, if you're to play along at home, you can line up where my shoulders here are here relative to the house in the background. So my shoulders are kind of between these two windows, you know, a little bit to the right of the chimney. Let me reload this. Relying on YouTube for this was definitely a good idea. Alright, here we go. Okay. So I'm taking steps back and back. So here, I still don't have to take a step yet, but you'll notice with each forward cutting motion, my shoulders always end up in that same general area. Alright, you'll have to take my word for it. Okay. So let's see some examples of other, maybe these videos will work. So examples of other strikes that happen within the weight shift phase. So we have Anton Kohutovich from 2013. So we can see when he strikes, his foot has pretty much just left the ground. Passes and takes some recovery steps. And then we have this guy from 2020. So he starts in a very low runner stance. So when he strikes, alright, so here's the point of impact. So his foot is, you know, is further along, I guess, than Anton's was when he strikes. And the reason I think this is because he's in a more crouched position. He's already, like, you know, he puts himself further along in the cut before he even starts, which allows him to drive more from the front foot, and therefore he makes the hit later in the strike. So also look at when he recovers, because his body was so you know, leaned over. He needs to really drive off of this foot in order to recover his hips. So after you take the step, your plant foot drives, so you're leaning when you hit, and then in order to recover, your plant foot has to drive your lower body under your upper body to allow you to land in good posture. And he also takes, you know, more recovery steps. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. So timing of the cut based on distance. So if you're at a no, so we take these two points and we kind of zoom in on that here. So this is your total step distance. So this is kind of like the arbitrary, you know, transitory barrier between you know, your cut while you are in what was it, the weight shift phase, and the cut in the recovery phase. So when you're in this range, your cut is going to land before your feet cross, and in this range your cut lands after the feet cross. So this is your direct attack range, your ballistic passing step range, and this is going to be your compound attack range. So you can kind of get a feel, when you're practicing, you can kind of get a feel for what you can do at each distance, and work from there towards an effective attack. Okay, so some practical application, developing your ballistic passing step. So finding your optimal lean. An exercise that you can do is start with your sword, or start in an upright stance, non-dominant foot forward. You can have a sword, or you don't actually need a sword for this. Extend it out in front of you, and then kind of lean and shift your weight forward onto your front leg. Keep your front leg planted, and kind of act like your sword is pulling you forward. So then you can kind of notice when you get to that point where you can no longer maintain balance and you're forced to step forward. So again, if you're trying this for the first time, start slowly and take multiple steps to recover. Don't land firm-footed yet. You know, over time, as you kind of start to notice where your balance shifts to the point where you have to step, you can add some explosiveness. You can start to push off your back foot a little bit more. And then, you know, if you eventually want to start trying to land firm-footed, again, start with smaller steps and work your way up to more lunge-like steps. So adding the cut in, I think it is helpful to have a target, so either an opponent or a dummy, and you can do kind of like that progression video that I tried to show that wasn't working. So start with at a distance where you don't have to step at all or lean, and then slowly, you know, step back in increments, in small increments, until, you know, you can't lean forward anymore without losing balance, and you're forced to take that step. So, I mean, the main thing to keep in mind is that, like, remember the goal. The goal is to get the sword to the opponent as quickly as possible. So everything else should be in service of that goal, including the step. So when I'm, you know, fencing and I want to like attack with a passing step, I'm not thinking about taking the step. I'm thinking about getting my sword to my opponent, and the step is just something that is there that I have to do in order to, you know, make it happen. Integrating the passing step into your game. So the first step in integrating the passing step into your actual fencing is to get in the habit of fencing with your non-dominant foot forward. You know, if you always, you know, fence with your dominant foot forward, then like, you know, obviously you're never going to develop a passing step because you're not going to be in position to do it. It's, you know, for a lot of people, it's a lot more comfortable to fence with the dominant foot forward. So it'll take some getting used to, and it might, you know, it'll feel awkward at first, but, you know, once you get used to it, I felt awkward doing it too at first, but like once you get used to it, it's like, you know, you'll it'll feel natural. It'll start to feel natural over time. So practice your swing and your step, using, you know, the drills that I mentioned before. Try to, you know, get your cut more efficient. You you want to be able to get under that 350 millisecond barrier, and keep the goal in mind of getting the sword to its target, and also understand your distances. So you can do the distance parrying drill, which Adrian came up with. So just maybe these will work, maybe not. So basically the idea is you have a partner wearing a fencing mask, and you start at a certain distance and try to hit them with a passing step, or actually a passing step doesn't matter, you don't need it. So you try to hit them, passing step if you need to, and they try to parry. If they successfully parry, then you take a step forward. If you land the hit successfully, then you take a step back. And that should give you a sense of, what your general direct attack distance is. And you can. It's possible to increase it over time a little bit by making your cut and your step more efficient. But you just, for fencing purposes, you need to have that awareness of what your correct distances are. So here we kind of start. We have the defender start in like a higher position. Adrian, when he does the drill, has the defender start in a low guard, so they have to, move their sword all the way up. Yeah, I think I'm not really sure which way is more optimal, but if you start in like a thumb tog, then it's too easy to parry. So, give the attacker a little bit of a chance, at least. And yeah, okay, so you can see the defender here starting from a lower position. All right. So that will pretty much do it. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, D Blue, for inviting me to do this lecture. And does anybody have any questions? No questions?
I guess that's a topic for another day, but have you, well, I guess you did, but it's mostly a rhetorical question, but have you considered looking at the footwork that precedes the passing step itself? So basically, what is the preparatory footwork before the passing step? I think like the Polish Fury fencers, everybody know, showed it showed a very interesting take on this footwork during their latest video.
Well, I think I talked a little bit about the half step and the false step before this, or during the presentation. Was there any other footwork that you had in mind?
Not really. It was indeed the half step, but what makes this concept interesting, in my opinion, is that it's actually written in the sources. Set your left foot forward before you strike, or extend the front foot out of the line, and so on. So
Gotcha.
basically, it's not unsupported. Actually, I think the description of passing steps is more accurate than we may think at the first glance.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
Could you talk a little bit about failed ballistic passing steps?
Failed ballistic passing steps. So when you don't land your attack.
Correct.
Okay. Um. So right. I guess I should have mentioned this. But I didn't. So basically, we talked about, if you, so say you're timing your step to land on the second half of the attack during the recovery phase. So you're doing a compound attack. You're going to have some kind of preparatory motion during the first part, be it like a beat or a feint or whatever. You kind of do the opposite when you do the ballistic passing step. So the first part of your step is occupied by the attack, but then you want to make use of the second part um, to prepare your next movement. So what I generally do is I'll throw my cut, and then you can tell pretty much right away if it's going to be parried. If it is going to be parried, then while I'm in my recovery phase, I will kind of bend my elbows a little bit, um, and it depends on my opponent. Sometimes it's somebody I know is going to just cut around right away, so I'll move into that parrying position. Otherwise, I'll kind of keep my point forward in order to like assess the next movement. So then you're going to be using your feeling and deciding what the next thing is. So by the time your foot lands, you're ready to make that movement. Um, but yeah, that's a good point that I should have mentioned, but forgot about. So thank you. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
In your opinion, what would be the most direct consequences of using passing steps on one's fencing? So, how does it change your whole interpretation of Lichtenauer using these passing steps? Did it change some techniques? Does it change the whole approach, or is it just a granular improvement?
Um, well, for me, I mean, personally, like I've always kind of assumed like the direct attack to exist and be there, and I've always considered that the techniques that we get are meant to like be used against direct attack. So as far as my like personal interpretations go, it hasn't really changed much, but it just what it mainly changes for me is um, the ability to put them into practice and also to like teach people how to do an effective direct attack, because previously, like if I watch like old videos of myself, I do attacks like I'm describing, like ballistic passing step attacks. I do them all the time in my sparring, but what I was teaching in my class was landing the attack when your foot lands, and that's kind of a holdover from kendo where we're supposed to land our hits on our foot at the same time. Um, so that's probably the biggest thing that it'll change for me is how I show this to other people. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that the glosses do assume that like we're going to be defending against direct attacks. So from that perspective, it'll make getting more people to do direct attacks will hopefully make like future interpretations more accurate. did I dance around that question or did I answer it? I'm not really sure.
No, it's fine.
You say something on the weight distribution, especially depending on how you decide how much do you lean forward? Is at the beginning of the step, right at the start.
Yeah. So let's go to the lines slide. Oh, I'm not streaming anymore. Well, anyway, so we talked about the straight line. Let's just share my screen again. We talked about the straight line idea. So as your foot leaves the ground, generally your leg and your torso will make a straight line. So that's going to start to inform your lean. So the difference between, so if we take that as like a baseline to how to define our lean, then it's going to depend on how crouched you are, so how bent your knees are, and how separated your feet are. So if you're very crouched and very separated, then it's going to be a very, low angle relative to the ground. So that means, you might have to make a high lean, or, if you're really doing that, you probably don't want to lean that much. So, so you can see here, like, well, let's look at the fencers. So the fencers they're doing flèches, so they're planning on running through. So it doesn't really matter, like, how well they can, push their hips back under, because they're not going to be landing upright. They're going to continue their momentum forward and stay lean. So you can see they're both, their front knees are very bent, which causes a very high rate of lean, because they're, just because the angle, it forms a triangle. So if you're more upright, then you're not going to lean as much because of just the way you're pushing. However, if you are upright like that and you need to cover a little bit more distance, then your lean tends to increase. So it'll go a little bit further than it was when your foot leaves the ground. So as far as defining the exact optimal angle for when you hit, I'm not exactly sure how to do that just yet, but I think that using that line as a baseline and then going from there will probably get you a decent result.
You said you would talk a bit about the difference in range between a non-passing and passing attack, and I don't think you did. It might be worth mentioning that.
So between a non-passing and a passing attack.
I.e., why a passing step will hit further than a lunge in your direct attack distance.
Okay. Why it will hit further than a lunge. I actually don't think that the range, like for direct attacks, I don't think that the range is actually that much longer than a lunge. Just because, obviously the step covers more distance, but if you do the step from a distance that, it would give you a range advantage over the lunge, then now you're kind of entering into compound attack territory. So as far as like raw distance, like to do a direct attack is concerned, I don't think there's really much of a difference between a lunge and a passing step. I think the differences lie in other areas, like your recovery and that kind of thing.
John asked in the lecture responses channel, but I will ask too, will the slides be available for us?
Yeah, I'll upload the slides. I'm also recording this on OBS, so I'll put it on some kind of YouTube channel.
Cool, thanks.
And I can make a list of all the videos that I referenced also. Anything else? D Blue asks, what about recovery of blade and arms after BPS? I'm not really sure what you mean by that, unfortunately.
I think this is similar to the question you already answered about like what you do if your attack fails.
Gotcha, yeah.
Yeah, you kind of already covered it.
Okay, yeah. Cool. So.
Maybe one question related to offline steps. So some offline steps are mentioned in the historical sources. So how would you, let's say, combine ballistic steps with this idea of offline stepping?
Sure.
Because that's kind of a meme in HEMA that you should step offline and so on. We
Right.
all knows that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, you know, throughout this presentation, I kind of focused on like getting directly to your opponent, going straight in, but you can do a ballistic, you know, step in any direction. Again, the only thing that makes it ballistic is the idea that you're attacking in the first part of the step rather than the second part. So you can do a step in any direction. In my opinion, if you're doing a direct attack, if you're doing an attack that you intend to land a hit with, I think going straight in is probably better, because the more angle you put on your step, the less distance you get from it. But, you know, if your opponent's breaking distance for you, if they're approaching you and you're doing a counterattack, then yeah, sure, you can do offline steps and, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Because one thing I've noticed personally is that you can't, it's fairly hard to perform offline motions during the weight shift phase, because you're not pushing in the right direction with your feet. But during the recovery phase, you can create some very interesting offline motions by like kicking the front leg offline in order to recover, like a sort of sideways lunge.
Yeah.
And maybe that would explain, you know, that terrible line in the Paul Ausbuch, which is that you need to step offline with cuts. And I don't remember the actual reason, but in my own experience, that would somehow lead to better binds if you're parried. Like if you go straight forward, it's very hard to perform a Vinden after a passing step, because there's just not enough room. And if you move offline, you sort of get enough room back to shorten the arms and counter riposte with a shortened thrust. So that may be an interesting piece to look at. I don't know, but maybe something worth exploring.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can, you know, as you're passing, once you've shifted your weight onto your left foot, you can like use it to add an extra lunging motion, and you can do that offline. I think that's what you were saying, right?
Yes, exactly. Lunging offline. I'm looking for a picture. Maybe it will be clearer for some people, but yes, that's exactly that.
Yeah. Personally, I haven't practiced that very much. I think like so if you're doing a ballistic passing step, then you've already thrown your attack by the time you switch to your offline motion, right? So you kind of do your attack, and then as you're recovering, you you know lunge yourself off to the side. So yeah, I mean, I can see that being useful.
Another thing which is worth noting about offline footwork for the attack is that it's very difficult to make an offline action when the opponent is not yet committed to a line, essentially. But if you're doing especially a half step style preparatory footwork, you can use that to induce them to commit in a way that then lets you try and move. So the individual step might just trying to do an offline step for an attack by itself doesn't really do much for you most of the time. But if you're doing the half step combination, you can kind of create a threat on one side and then make the step more towards the other side.
Yep.
And try and work your way past them like that, which can be a particularly handy combination.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can even make the half step slightly offline, so you just create enough angle to move in any direction you wish.
Yeah, you kind of zigzag in, basically.
Yeah, that's the Travis method, at least in my mind. Yeah, I do that sometimes. With the Zwerghaus, that I was working on Zwerghaus a lot over the summer when I could get a little bit of fencing in, and that's pretty much how I found it was possible to make them work with the sideways motion, was to take really a fairly large half step in off to the left side, and then kind of spring off of that to the right, then make your attack.
That's actually how tennis and squash players move. If you look at their sideways motions, if they want to go to the right, then they throw the left foot to the left, or like they create a weight shift by throwing the left foot to the left, and then they spring from that. Like they move the body first using that left foot, using a half step, I would say, of the left foot, and then they spring to the right. That's fairly interesting to watch.
That's kind of like the false step idea. Kind of putting your foot under like your weight so you can immediately start going.
Yeah, and also putting the foot slightly out to the side makes it easier to push yourself in the other direction. If you're, much like it's actually really hard to step in a direction if you're balanced perfectly on your leg, because you can't put yourself anywhere except upwards without leaning first. If you're moving straight forward and your weight is kind of like, by putting your non-dominant foot out to the side a little bit, you can then, by pushing off it, push your weight in the direction of your dominant foot, which helps a lot with trying to move sideways. Versus if you put your foot straight forwards and your weight is kind of directly in a forwards and back line relative to your opponent, and you're not then pushing with your non-dominant foot will push you forwards or push you backwards or push you up, but it won't really push you out.
Makes sense.
A simpler kind of illustration of the same idea would be to just stand on one leg and try to do it.
Is there a structural advantage for passing steps compared to lunges? I don't know. I think there could be. I think there could be advantages to each of them. Does anybody else have any ideas on that? Are there structural advantages to passing steps over lunges?
Well, you can throw some rotational power in passing steps, and it's harder to do that with lunges. It's possible, like if you look at Mayer, there is some fairly impressive twists of the torso in the whole Dusac section. So, like you can hold high vom tag with the right foot forward, and then you strike from there, and it's fairly powerful. But it's usually easier with passing steps. I feel like if you're two-handed, it's fairly clear. At the very least, you can generate more power with tighter motions. You can generate strong power with lunges, but you need a very retracted position or some form of move net.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't think about the hip rotation, but yeah. There's no hip rotation with a lunge.
There are definitely some lunge mechanics which would disagree with you on that, but they tend to create a kind of counter rotation that pushes the arm forward instead of a rotation into the cut. So you get a different kind of result.
Fair enough.
But the weird starfish Neapolitan lunge uses a huge amount of hip rotation.
You can also actually rotate with a lunge if, I don't know, consider like rising false edge cuts. With your right leg forward, there is a small amount of hip rotation, but it's nowhere near as free as using a passing steps. And I think this is what the forward to the Lichtenauer glosses tell. That if you don't use a passing step, the cut is shortened and it's weaker because it cannot take its proper pass. You can use hip rotations without passing steps, but you will end up stuck. I would say halfway stuck, I would say.
Yeah.
You can also get some more interesting angles if you passing step as opposed to lunge.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's easier to change directions.
Well, not even just change directions, but with your initial attack, with the passing step, I can throw a much stronger, more present in the bind underhow than if I did it with a lunge step.
Sure. Yeah. So is anybody who previously didn't use passing steps going to try to use them now? Have I changed any minds through this? Probably not.
For me, it's easy because I have never done any cuts, but I will probably try to do this. Sounds very good.
Good.
Do we have any more questions for Steve?
All right. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. I guess I'll wrap it up there then.
Sounds good. Thank you, Steve.